Welcome to the Better Birth podcast. I'm super excited to have Eric Bahn, one of our investors from Hustle Fund. So would you like to just chat a little bit about sort of your career? I know, of course, you run Hustle Fund now, and it's the third fund, a $46.5 million fund. But yeah, would love to know more about your background and also how you like to self-identify in terms of, just like your career.
Yeah, certainly. So I am the very fortunate co-founder of this great fund, Hustle Fund, along with two other incredible women, Elizabeth and Sheehan. And that relationship that I've had with those women spans 23 years at this point. So I met them my freshman year of college. I was born and raised in Detroit, and then met them at Stanford in the year 2000, all as freshmen. And then in the remaining time, at different times, we were co-investors, investors in each other's businesses, now co-founders. Each of us has a son and daughter of similar age. I love their spouses as well. It's an exercise of getting to grow old with these incredible folks. So I think the defining part of my identity is riding the coattails of these spectacular women. And I actually include my wife as well, who at different times was co-founder with me too.
Oh, cool.
So mostly spent my time building media businesses, some that worked out well, some that didn't, in much of my 20s and 30s. And then at different times also worked as a product manager at places like Instagram and Intuit and Facebook. And then now Hustle Fund in 2017. So it's interesting. The question that you posed, Catherine, in terms of how I identify with my career, and this is apropos, I think, to this conversation, is I've actually been in the past few years trying to resist tying my identity to work so closely. And I know you're not necessarily implying that, but I'm a venture capitalist by day, and I like investing and working with talented founders like yourself. But I think so much more of my identity, which has been a surprise in my life, is around just my family, just being a dad, a husband, and a good friend and good son, I hope too. So yeah, that's kind of the strange cocktail of identities that I try to mix in my mind.
Yeah, that's awesome. No, I think it's interesting. I think one thing I wanted to accomplish with the series was sort of portray I feel like a lot of investors and founders, especially in tech, they're so busy and have a public persona. I get a sense that they kind of live a double life. Like when I talk to them about their family, like it's like this whole important thing, but it's just like never discussed or really portrayed even online. I feel like you have more dad content than the average tech Twitter person, like with your van brand and stuff.
Oh yeah.
The dad van, but it's interesting. So I'm curious, like with that, how would you describe your mission in life personally and also professionally?
I try to live by this mantra. It's a Buddhist phrase that I encountered maybe like 10, 15 years ago, which is when you bow to the mirror, the reflected image bows back. And the way that I interpret that quote is the way that you treat your environment will naturally be reciprocated in kind. So if you're really an asshole to everyone, like expect like a bunch of assholery to be bounced back at you. Just the environment sort of shapes itself around you. Or you can lead with kindness and love and vulnerability. And that is often so rewarded in huge ways back to you as well. So from, I guess, a personal mission perspective, one is actually showing that leadership through kindness can work and that you can actually win, right? And, there is sort of this archetype that we've seen in the past several decades of like this brilliant jerk, some like engineering dude, usually it's a dude, who's, rebellious and a little bit of an asshole to other people and, kind of like forges their way through. Yeah, that is something that sometimes can work. But I think there are so many examples as well of people who are just showing that kindness and like authenticity, and high EQ can be a path towards fantastic leadership as well. I don't know if I exhibit all those traits, but like I want to show through my own example too, which is why I think I talk about my family so much on tech Twitter, because I want to show that there's like a little bit of well-roundedness that can happen as well. And then in terms of just like the work that I'm trying to achieve with VC, I don't think I ever really wanted to ever become a investor, but I did experience a lot of toxicity as a founder. And trying to produce a fund that shows that, if you invest with kindness and back people with really high EQ, like Catherine, we can show that, we can build a really good culture around Silicon Valley as well. And hopefully drive a little bit more inclusivity, invite more people in. So by the time my kids want to raise capital for their own companies. And I really hope they choose not to be entrepreneurs. Maybe a doctor or something would be cool, or nurse or something else. But if they choose that path, then hopefully it's a healthier environment in that future.
I'm curious what you thought was toxic about Silicon Valley.
Well, a lot of things. So I guess I can talk about my wife's experiences. So like, she is a founder as well. And, there are a lot of creepy dudes who sort of take advantage of the fact that it's mostly men, and, conversations like, let's hear your pitch at 9:30 in the hotel lobby or something like that, all those kinds of gross things. I didn't experience that as much as a man. But what I did experience as a founder was, at least maybe like 20 years ago ish, like when I was raising capital for my first company, there were fewer VCs. And because there are fewer choices for founders like myself, and they're just a relatively small group of very privileged men who are gatekeepers of all the venture capital, they were such assholes to me. I mean, like, it was like pitching Caesar, like 9 or 10 Caesars all wearing Patagonia vests in these like mahogany, like sandhill conference rooms. And like, they didn't give a shit about me. They were like kind of like all thumbs down, or like playing on their phone, or just really rude. And it felt so strange that there's this asymmetric power dynamic that where our founders were doing all the work to make these people rich, but like, the respect wasn't really being reciprocated in the same way. So that I think was a really big kind of PTSD that we're trying to apply and fix, hopefully in our funds model too.
Yeah. Well, I do get really friendly vibes from you guys. So I feel like everyone gets those vibes.
I hope so.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, chatting about your kids, I'd love to transition into how you thought about family planning, especially as it sort of played a role in your career. So I'm curious how many kids you have, and also how old they are, and then what motivated you to decide to start having kids.
Yeah, so I have 2 kids. Owen is 8 and Stella is 5, and I think we're done. But the interesting kind of earlier, before they even arrived, like when I was in my 20s, was I was a little bit more leaning towards not ever having kids. Like 55% against, 45% yes. But my wife really, really wanted kids. So that tilted me back. And then now as a dad today, I look back, I'm like, wow, Eric, like you had no idea how great this was going to be. Yes, all like the poop and pee and the lack of sleep, that stuff's annoying in the early days. But essentially, this may be the wrong way to think about being a parent, but I've added just 2 more amazing roommates. Right. Like, have you I'm sure like in your 20s or in college, like Catherine, you've been in these situations where you got to live with like your best friends, and coming home was just like joy. Right. It's just like, I get to hang with my best friends. Right. And like, it's kind of like that most of the time. Right. That's really what it comes down to. So I loved it. And then, when it came to family planning, we waited a little bit later. So not, I guess in the context of modern culture today, it's not too late. We had our first kid when my wife and I were the same age. We were 33 at the time. So we're more established. We were super fortunate. We had we exited our first company that we co-founded together, and so it had a little bit more resources too. And so things like nannies, like they became far more affordable, so that we can set ourselves up to continue to invest in our jobs. But all that said, it was a rough first few years, and we can dive into that any way that you like.
For sure. Why didn't you want to have kids?
Oh my gosh, so many reasons. When you start working, and then each year you realize like my job is like paying me more, like I'm starting to like get out of debt. The vacations are getting more and more awesome, and like I'm still sleeping in on the weekends, and like going out to dinner anytime I want. Quality of life just continued to improve as I got older, and having a kid is massively expensive, especially in the Bay Area, but just like full stop, it's just massively expensive. So I think that there's a cost component to why I didn't want kids, but I think it was more driven by the former, or I guess the earlier part, which is just like the lifestyle stuff. I want to visit like 100 countries in my lifetime. I want to, I'm starting to get into like high performance driving. Like at some point I'd love to get like a Porsche. But now I'm going to wait into my 50s for that to happen, and just stick with the minivan for a while. all those kinds of small things. But I deeply underestimated just like the how much your heart expands and their capacity for love expands, like once you have kids. And for that, I'm just like, holy smokes, Eric, like young Eric, like you really weren't thinking about this in terms of the way that you should think about it, in terms of how much love that you get to experience from this.
That's awesome. I'm curious if you co-founded the company with your wife while you were already married, and if that kind of helped you think about having kids, because in a way you kind of raised something already together.
Yeah, that's I've never thought of it like that. That's a cool question. So, no, I got together with my wife 20 years ago. So we started dating in college, and then she was actually working at Accenture for 5 years, kind of helping me as I started bootstrapping. I was also at a different company, kind of bootstrapping this business, and then we left together essentially to focus on this business. In our 20s, when we were dating and then eventually got married during that first company, it was interesting because like I would really hang out with her primarily during the day. We were sitting next to each other, we'd take these nice lunches, and during the nights and weekends we wouldn't really see each other. We would hang out with our own friends or go on like our own friend trips, or I would go to like startup meetups and so forth. It was really neat. And that's very opposite to my schedule today. Actually, that's not true. Like I'm in the garage. I'm working here usually. My wife is usually working upstairs. She has her own business here. So I do get to see her quite a bit during the day, but our nights and weekends are now super precious because that is very, very focused time on our family. And there has been a real trade-off on that. I mean, this wasn't quite the question, but I don't really go to that many startup meetups. I don't really like to go out to dinner with other people, unless it's A, friends, or B, like a really, really necessary work event. So you just have to be really careful about choosing your time now that I'm a parent.
Okay, interesting. So did it change your view having kids because you had done this company?
Well, let's expand upon that. What can you tell me a little bit more about that behind that?
Yeah, I guess I always think it's interesting when married couples are also co-founders, because I wonder how it like shifts the dynamic or maybe even enhances it, because you're already raising something together. So then when it comes to kids as well, you already kind of know how you'll think about it, and maybe a Jira board for like how you organize parenting tasks and stuff like that.
For sure. Okay. I do love the spirit of this question. So one of the unique things of having worked with my wife, and it was an amazing work experience together. Like we loved working together. And my dream is to someday go back to working for her. She's got a great coaching business. And I was like, after like I get older, like I'll focus on your business as your employee. And the thing that I got out of it is, I don't know if this is going to sound a little bit too clinical, but I swear there's a lot of warmth behind it, is we treat our family very much like a business. And here's what I mean by that. Like every year we hold an annual meeting where we'll review our values. It's always on Christmas Day. And then we'll do a retrospective on like, how did the year go? Did we actually live up to the values that we set in the previous year? We'll have a conversation with the kids of like, what are some things that we may want to add in terms of values or themes for the coming year? We'll write it down in a document, and then we print and frame it over our dining room every year. So I think being really mindful about the culture that we're trying to instill within our family, and doing this through annual meetings is something that's really great. The other thing too is just the feedback that we provide to our kids or to each other. It can feel really business-like. Right. I mean, just like, sitting down with like a direct report and saying like, hey, I know there's these kinds of behaviors, like you shouldn't push your sister, like when she takes her Legos, and let's talk about constructive ways for you to express these kinds of frustrations. You change the words a little bit, and it actually really does apply to like a business setting, but also really critical is actually the feedback my wife gives me and me to her. We've never really had an argument before. Maybe once in 20 years where it got quite heated, but almost never. And the reason why is my wife is just like such a CEO minded person. Like if she's like angry at me because of something that might happen within the family that was my fault or something, she doesn't like immediately vent at me. She kind of takes a beat, will collect her thoughts, and then provide it to me in a really constructive feedback setting that's normally quite calm. And it's amazing to see that she has a capacity to do that. And I see her doing that with her team all the time too. So I'd say that it's been a tremendous asset, just like having that kind of business relationship. And not to mention, we trade advice on our own companies all the time. That's a very common, actually, dinner time conversation that we want to have in front of our kids so that they can also learn through osmosis about how to run businesses.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, my mom's a founder as well, so we have like quite a business natured relationship. Like we'll fight about something, but then an hour later, I know I can call her, and we do fight quite aggressively, but I feel like I can call her after and be like, oh, can you review this like agreement that I'm sending someone or whatever, and I know that she'll just be like really like we're able to compartmentalize it well.
Move on, right?
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. Well, I'd love to know how you think about sort of your family structure. So I know you kind of described you have two kids, but yeah, are there any like particular family dynamics that you think are really unique, or anything that you maybe aspired to have?
Yeah. So I'll start with this one quick story here. Many years ago, as I was sort of making a decision with my wife as to whether we want to go for kids or not, I sat down and had dinner with a pretty prominent CEO of a pretty prominent company. And the guy was really super impressive. I mean, he's got kids too, but just ran these incredible businesses in the past 20 years. And then I asked him, like, hey, any advice for me? We're thinking about having kids, on how you were able to balance your relationship with your wife, your kids, along with the companies that you ran. And I got kind of shook by his response. He said, like, I had my wife basically do all that stuff. Like, I realized I need to make sacrifices to make my career work. And I think they understand it too. But really, it was on my wife, right? And I hated that response. I absolutely hated it, because you only kind of get one shot in producing a child experience, and that frankly just like frames the entire relationship, even as adults. I'm learning that now, even with my dad and mom. So we have actually one of our core themes that's actually hanging in a dining room that hasn't changed in the last 4 years, which is it's about quality time and quantity time. I think both matter a lot. Like, my dying wish is like, when my kids reflect back as adults, of like, someone asks the question like, what was it like with your mom and dad? I hope one of the first things that they said is like, they were always around and quite accessible. Right. So I measure myself on that a lot, which is quality is, presence, which is try to put the phone away, try to put the devices away, actively play and engage, and, make it feel like they're being totally seen and heard. It's not perfect, but I try. And then the quantity time is just like a lot of time together, right? Yeah. Just like we do like a ton of sleepovers. We do a lot of stuff together on the weekends. And if I have to take meetings in the evenings, I'm super mindful of just like what that trade-off is. And I talk to my wife about it too. So it's both of those things that we're really trying to strive for.
Well, what do you qualify as sleepovers if you're all in the same house?
Oh, we're going to do this tonight. So I have a folding futon mattress, and then we'll put them in the living room, and then we'll watch some movies, eat some popcorn, and then we'll all sleep together in the living room.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, it's actually really comfortable to do that.
Yeah, it's a cuddle puddle.
It is. Yeah, it's fantastic. I mean, like, they're very cuddly people. So like, yeah. It's kind of like a serotonin, dopamine, like, it's like a Burning Man in the living room in terms of all the flooded hormones happening.
Yeah, that's awesome. Cool. So it seems like you were very intentional about having kids, but so when you first found out that you were having your first baby, how did that feel? Was it a shock, or how did it feel to have it be real?
Yeah, we have a kind of a super ridiculous privilege story, I guess, in terms of like how I found out. So at the time, my wife and I took a year off because we just sold our first company. Yeah. And we're just like chilling, sabbaticaling. So we decided to travel the world, went to 17 countries. So in Poland, no, it was Germany. In Germany is when we actually discovered that we were pregnant. We had just started to try, and it was actually a fairly quick process. And then in Germany, I remember like going to the pharmacy, getting like this like all in German thing. This is before like Google Translate. So I was like, ein Baby test, like just like trying to talk to people. That might be totally wrong. So, and then we found out and we're pregnant. So like, I guess it was a combination of just like, oh shit,
Mhm.
right? Like this is starting to get real. Uh, and I think it was primarily that. Like, it was like my wife's experience. If you talk to her, maybe she did at some point, was probably like much more excited. But I was more of like, oh shit,
Mhm.
right? Because I, even at that point, even though we were going on the process, I didn't quite know what I would be like as a dad or whether I'd actually enjoy it. Um, so we discovered that, and then we came back, and then we had came back to California and did that entire process.
Okay,
But I'll
awesome.
pause there. Yeah.
Yeah. Was it a pretty smooth pregnancy? And how did you think about kind of supporting it, especially being the partner and not the one that's pregnant?
Yeah. So I would say overall for both is relatively smooth. We were unusually fortunate in that conception was pretty straightforward for us. It didn't take too long for both kids. And then the second thing too was we never experienced any miscarriages, which are increasingly common here.
Yeah.
So for that, I think I feel like enormously blessed, and my wife does too, that like, those are pretty smooth. As uh my wife is fairly active, so she, tried to keep a pretty normal life, and I did my best to make sure that like I served as primary and settling the home and like getting the rooms all set up for the kids, all that stuff. But like really the job didn't begin until after the kids came out, and her pregnancies were actually, well, our first one was rougher. So she had 44 hours of labor for her first son, and then eventually that was emergency C-section. And then with the second kid, it was like a planned C-section. Like usually there's most people just do another C-section. That's a little
Yeah.
bit more chill at that point because you just schedule it. So yeah, that was kind of a crazy process, that C-section. Like, you're literally cutting abdominal muscles. So, she can't like hold things or like really like sit up very easily for like 5 weeks. So, you got your child that you're trying to help, and they're largely dependent on breast milk. So you do, like, for the men out there listening, like if it's your first kid, I think the easiest low hanging fruit is maybe two things. One, do all the diaper changes, get up and just do it. Because like, you don't want to burden your wife or your significant other that's doing this stuff. It's just they're tired, right? And the second thing is just do all the cleaning, right? I mean, there's a lot of laundry that you got there. There's so many bottle cleanings, and it's tedious, but it's like one at the very lowest hanging fruit to just cover those things and then cook. I guess the third.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Did you have any kind of tips along those lines during pregnancy as well that you were like, I'm going to take care of this?
I'm getting a little bit of male pregnancy brain as well right now, because if that's even like an insulting thing to even say, because like I've blacked out a lot of this as well. But yeah, I mean, every pregnancy is different. I'd say that morning sicknesses, like in like phase one trimester, my wife definitely had that. So I wanted to respect, like, your energies is really low, you're feeling kind of sick. So, let me just try to anticipate your needs and like make sure all of our meals are all set up. And then I do all the cleaning and, all the kinds of small things. My love language is like acts of service.
Mhm.
So that's what I do even to this day. I do all the laundry and cleaning in our home because like I just enjoy doing that kind of stuff, is to express that to my family. And then but like really when it kicks into gear is well, okay, let's keep talking about that pregnancy. Not some memories are starting to come back. So just like showing through other acts of service too, like in that first pregnancy, it's worth going to like one of those prenatal classes that
Mhm.
teaches you like diapers and all that stuff. And there might be those like Lamaze classes or like yoga classes and things like that. Those are kind of fun, frankly. So participating in that. So I wanted to demonstrate just a lot of quality and quantity time too, to
Yeah.
just remind my wife that I was present with her as well.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. So thinking about Lamaze classes and just like preparing for birth in general, how did you guys go about creating your birth plan? And like what role did you play in that in particular?
Yeah. So we uh this is like a piece of advice I think that my mother-in-law had shared that I thought was pretty good. She's
Mhm.
like, don't read too much. So, I read the What to Expect When You're Expecting book. That's like a classic. I really love the baby center newsletters. They do a great job where you can just pump in like how many weeks along are you, and you can get like an update like your baby's the size of an avocado, and like they can grasp something or something. It's
Yeah.
fun, especially for the first one to follow that stuff. And they do give you like a spoon-fed drip campaign of like nice advice too. So I love all that stuff. That's great, but knowing too much is actually a problem, right? Like it's very easy, especially when it's your first kid, to just rat hole down like horrible edge case scenarios, right?
Yeah.
It's like, if this happens, then do this, if that, do that. And my mother-in-law was just like, you just be a little more ignorant. like we've been making babies for a long time, and you'll figure it out. And it's largely like the Mike Tyson rule once the baby does come out, which is just like, you can have a strategy until you get punched in the face, right? It's just so that's what it kind of felt like. In terms of like the birth plan, like we did do a fair amount of research and wanted to make sure that we had a plan for how we wanted to arrive. We had all the bags packed. There are some scenarios too, like if there is a C-section, what kinds of courses of action do we want to see? We want to also, I think this is a good move on our part, we set up a trust for our family as well as an advance directive. So we worked with a state attorney to make sure that we square away, like if something happens to us as parents, like is there a way for our assets to be moved to our kids? Or if like emergency situations happen to our health with advance directive, like when do we exercise things like do not resuscitate or other kinds of choices like that? So some of that cleanup I think was really good. But I would say that like day of, the birth plan is kind of a loose guide. There are things that you say that you want, but then in practice doesn't really make sense. I'll give you an example of this, which is like one of the things that we rat holed a lot was this notion of microbiome exposure through the birth canal. So like if you have a C-section baby, they don't go through the birth canal. And there is actually some evidence of like, maybe they start to have problems like allergies, and both my kids do, frankly. So one plan was just like, if C-section, then get like some cloth and then shove it up the birth canal, take it and then rub it on their face. That's actually a not like crazy thing. Like people do this, but in practice, that's like hyper uncomfortable for the mom. And like we made game time decisions for both kids that like, we like sort of attempted it. And then it was just like, you're already suffering too much. Let's just not do it.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things where I'm kind of mixed in terms of like, should I feel guilty about that? But I found that like, no, I mean, like, we had our strategy. It just didn't make sense at the time when you're on the ground, right? It's like war planning, and then you're actually in the battlefield. It's like shit just changes, right? So small things like that.
Yeah. Okay. So how did the birth actually go down? Like from like when you guys decided to like, you basically decided that birth was happening up until you had the baby. Cause I know you talked about like an extensive labor and C-section.
Yeah. So my wife was starting to have contractions. At this point, it was like 39 weeks or 40 weeks. So it was time. And you call the hospital and they're like, well, the contractions, are kind of far apart. You wait. And then we waited as long as we could until we felt like it was the right time. I can't remember what that frequency was. It was like, within 5 minutes, 10 minutes, or something like that.
Yeah. Typically 411 is a common rule.
Okay.
Like,
Thank you
I
for
think it's like 4 minutes apart. And something like that.
That sounds right. So thank you. So we take her to the hospital. And then I think a really classic thing is actually most people come too early. And we were kind of that. So I don't think we quite followed 411. I just freaked out. I was like, let's just go. And then but they're kind enough to let us like wait. And then eventually we were admitted. So the issue was just the dilation was taking too long. It was 44 hours of labor. She didn't sleep at all during that period of time. She actually got kind of annoyed at me. This is kind of a side story because I took the time to also write like a blog post of like, I'm about to become a dad. And then later on, she was like, why the hell were you like doing that? And so just like paying attention to me. So I haven't lived that one quite down. But we waited and the dilation was just not getting to that point after 44 hours. And that's when our doctor was just like, let's just get this baby out, like it's going to start to affect their heart rate or, their brain if you just, keep this kind of pressure up. And then we take her to the surgery. So this is pre-pandemic. So dads were certainly allowed. Maybe they're allowed back now. And I just remember a few things about that. So at the time we were at Stanford, great hospital. And the OR was extraordinarily bright. Right. So
Mhm.
like it was like 44 hours. I think it was just like we were kind of used to kind of like a more dark setting. It was just, we're so tired, we're trying to
Yeah.
sleep and stuff. And it was just crazy bright, which is what you should expect. It was also super cold, right?
Mhm.
Like that OR, I don't know if that's just typical, but like ORs, it was just like really, really cold in there. It felt like it was like 60 degrees. And then my wife was being pumped by all sorts of medicine, painkillers, like antibiotic, all these things. And she was
Was she
like
on an
visibly shaking and
epidural?
shivering.
Yeah. Was she on an epidural?
Yeah, she was.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
So like tons of drugs in her system. She's tired. She's like shivering and shaking. They give her like this warm blanket. There's a sort of this curtain that kind of is placed over her abdomen so she can't quite see. But
Mhm.
I wanted to see it. And I
Mhm.
saw the whole thing. I saw the incision. I saw the
Oh my gosh.
like
Was it
everything. Like
traumatizing?
no, it was amazing. It was
Interesting.
I don't know if I quite recommend it for everyone. You can't be a
Yeah.
student. My dad's a surgeon, so I kind of
Okay.
like grew up like talking about this stuff. I even saw some
Yeah.
stuff. But like and then Owen, our son, comes out. I didn't know like what the first words would be when I saw him, but they pulled him out. He's very pink. And then I said, he's beautiful. Like I literally shouted, he's beautiful. And he was. And he still is. But like and then they come out, they test him, the skin colors, and just make sure that like everything's looking good, his butt, his penis, everything. I got to cut the cord, of course, before all that stuff happened. That was pretty fun. It was like gelatinous looking, like kind of
Yeah.
yellowish, very, very cool. And then I got to see my wife getting sewn up too.
Mhm.
So that was really neat too. Actually, just like wow, that's like what's inside her, and just like I'm seeing it all close up. So they bring the baby as quickly as possible once they've assessed it to the mom, and I still have this beautiful photo of my wife's head. She's wearing like her shower cap kind of thing. Looks dead tired, looking at the baby, and then upside down because like she's laying flat, and they kind of bring it to her head is Owen, and they're kind of like nuzzling each other's face, and that's one of my favorite pictures of all time. Um, yeah, that's what that experience is like. But just it was your heart rate just goes up a lot when you go into the OR for whatever reason because it's
Yeah.
just you see all these tools, all these doctors and nurses. There's like 8 people in there, right?
Right.
And your wife is shaking or your significant other. So I won't forget that. But watching my kid come out for the first time, I'm also not going to forget that too. It was super cool.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm curious if you guys were assisted by midwives and doulas or anyone other than like physicians.
Yeah. We never did for both pregnancies, but in
Hmm.
hindsight, I kind of think we should have. It took me a while to really understand that like midwives, doulas, they're awesome coaches and
Yeah,
also just really, really good second opinion and advocates for the parents too, and the safety of the baby.
right.
So the problem with this kind of situation was like, I think about actually a country like Japan, where
Mhm.
there's actually relatively few C-sections, right? And I'm like, but there's like a lot of C-sections actually, especially in California.
Yeah.
So in hindsight, I'm like, maybe we're a little bit C-section happy
Mhm.
in America. I don't know if that's a good or bad thing. And so the benefit of a doula or midwife is because they do this so much and have seen so many scenarios, hopefully they're veterans. You can sort of just like get their opinion too, because at the end of the day, it's almost like a principal
Yeah.
agent problem. It's just like I gotta listen to what the doctor has to say, I guess.
Mhm.
And it's not very feasible to just like quickly Google things and like feel confident in those
Yeah.
moments.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, the C-section rate is highest in the US, I think, amongst like developing nations.
Yeah,
So people think it's sort of linked to like maternal mortality
yeah,
and yeah, there's lower C-section rates on births with midwives because they tend to be more like holistically inclined and things like that. So
totally.
um yeah, it's kind of interesting. Is there anything that you wish you did differently with your birth besides potentially getting a doula and midwife?
I think a few things I would have loved to have done. One is actually we didn't really understand this exercise of like doing values as a family until after our kids came, and I think it would have been good to actually have more of those conversations prior to the kids' arrival, of just
Mhm.
like what's the expectation in terms of how much time each of us is expected to be at home, or how involved our parents should be. um, it ended up being fine for us, but I can see a lot of thrash. One of the big surprise is if you have parents and you have a good relationship with them, or even if you don't, like the role that grandparents start to play, like it's almost like a different phase of your relationship with your own family, because now they also serve as like secondary caretakers in times,
Mhm.
or at least different kinds of role models too, right? So that one, I think, we've lived away from our parents for most of our adult life, but the desire to be close to them was really, really strong. And
Mhm.
eventually my parents actually moved closer to us. So that was a big blessing. I think the other thing too is just especially I'm speaking to the partners of the dads or the partner that is not giving birth. um I like, you got to respect the fact that there's like so much happening and changing within a woman's body that is like ridiculously tiresome and also quite frustrating too. Their ligaments get loose, they get like really fresh, like, they can like overstretch themselves, and like all these kinds of like things are happening that is like, I think I deeply underestimated the, I don't know if I could call it trauma, but it's almost like near trauma that women go through in the pregnancy. So like in the second birth, I think I was even kinder towards my
Mhm.
wife. And I think that's a lesson that I figured out for myself. Actually, my wife never complained about it, but like, just like the sacrifice that like, her body had to go through to carry this kid to term is like ultra wild, actually. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, interesting. A common tweet that I see on tech Twitter is like, I'm having a baby next week. Like, what advice do you have for me? And it's commonly from dad. So what would you say to those kind of tweets?
I think a couple things. One is, take a lot of video, especially video over pictures, and not just video of the good times, also video of the bad times. Like the 3 a.m., like the kid cannot go to sleep, like everyone's frustrated, or scrape of the knee. That one can feel annoying for the kids sometimes, but like, I look back actually on just like celebrating this journey, and it's not always been good. There's actually quite a bit of bad moments, but the bad moments are actually really fun as well in
Mhm.
hindsight. And that's actually at times even like moments that I kind of miss too. It's like, oh my gosh, I totally remember when Owen like fingernail like scratched his face up, and like, I was like screaming. I took that
Yeah.
video, and that was like, that was kind of wild. By the way, they can't control their hands, so that's what happens, right? The babies out there.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's a big one. The other one too is just like, I don't know if this is gonna sound too cliche, but my kids are already getting older, like
Mhm.
5 and 8. And it was ridiculously hard, the lack of sleep, especially in the beginning. But now I'm like sad that like, oh my gosh, they're like not babies at all anymore, right? They're children, and soon they're going to be teenagers, and soon they're going to be adults, and time does move pretty quick.
Mhm.
So one of the big goals that I have as a dad when it comes to quality time and quantity time is actually designed around two very specific experiences in their lives. Is a period between 0 to 5, and then preteen. So I read something from like a cognitive scientist, which says like a lot of imprinting of child behavior, also relationship behavior, and just like mental models of what good is set in the year 0 to 5.
Mhm.
So like, if you can be really present with your kids, if you have the privilege to do that, and like also show like your respect and love for your partners and your friends and your family, that's something that is deeply imprinted 0 to 5. And then preteen is also the area of really fast brain development. I'm not really quite sure what to expect there, except I want to be very present, especially presence. Like, that's when I'm like gonna double down on like coaching like sports teams, and like making sure that I give them plenty of time, and like remind myself to be really kind to them. And I think the last thing I'll just share is this, and this bloviation, is that just remember, parents, that your child has no prefrontal cortex, right? Like, it doesn't really happen until maybe like 4, 5, 6, when they sort of kind of buds. So like, if you're like seeing your toddler do stupid shit, or like or things that like is pissing you off, it's never the right move to just like scream at them. And I have, I'll admit that, like, I get frustrated too, but like, try not to, because just remind yourself that they have no rational center of their brain yet
Yeah.
that is quite formed, right? So if they're like, pouring like their milk on the carpet like this, and you're telling them to like, please like stop doing that. And, they may not quite have the mental capacity to figure that out yet. So just a lot of patience, right? And then later you can yell at them.
Yeah. Okay. Love that. Cool. Well, I'd love to move on to postpartum and parenting questions, but my last birth related question is, did you guys do cord blood banking? And what was your kind of exposure to it, if any?
Yeah. So, I love that you said yes to Hustle Fund and allowing us to invest in Anja. And the answer is we didn't, but I really wish that we did. This is actually an area of pretty big regret for me. Like it's one of those things where, when you buy like an insurance policy, like it's often like deprioritized as like, hopefully I'll never have to use this kind of thing. But in hindsight, I'm just like, that was such a special moment where we could have easily afforded and captured something that and where like where science is progressing so fast, like this could actually be the difference between like saving their lives or not. Like I'm smiling when I say this, but like I'm just like the rate by which I think science is like getting so exciting around like stem cells and things like this. Like I just think that it is, I don't know why we didn't actually take this more seriously, other than I think our first pass was just like, this doesn't seem that important right now. No, I mean, like we did all the other things. We set up a trust, right? We did like all these like estate planning things. And I think like the biggest estate planning mistake that we made, and by the way, Catherine did tell me to say this, is actually the fact that we didn't do any cord blood banking. So I really recommend it. And it's not just even for yourself either. This could be like for other family members, right? That like experience like similar DNA, or other people too. So I just think there's like so much benefit and upside. And I'm really excited that the culture around cord blood banking is actually starting to change, where like these conversations feel far more common now, even than like 8 years ago.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. Thank you for that plug. Okay, awesome. Well, yeah, I'd love to move into postpartum, because I know especially you mentioned that for you it was much more involved. So I'm curious what your typical routine was like immediately after birth, and how did you go about finding that routine, or was it just kind of like whatever happened?
Yeah. So I'll also share some realities here. Like a few years ago, I put out this tweet about being a parent, and I think I still hold it to this day. It starts kind of like negative. It's a little bit like clickbait, right? Of just like kids are like, terrible for your mental health and your financial health and all that stuff. Yet at the same time, it's like one of the greatest things I've ever done. I mean, in our case too, it was a little bit unusual. So I'll take like the second kid to start, because that one actually felt like more recent, obviously, and my memories are fresher. So I was just starting Hustle Fund, right? When my wife got pregnant, and then we had her daughter. And my wife was actually relatively early with her company too.
Yeah, I was same as Elizabeth, right? Because she was also just having her
Yeah,
kid.
yeah. Elizabeth was having her second kid too. She
Yeah.
her kid is about a year older, so she had her journey too, which she did a fantastic job of interviewing her about. Everyone should listen to that episode. And so it was rough. We had already had a 3-year-old at that point, and basically had crappy sleep for 3 years. And then now we're gonna have a second kid, and then I'm someone that just like is totally wrecked. So is my wife. Like we have like terrible sleep. So it was a little bit spicier in terms of just like we have a lot less patience and resilience. Was part one. Part two was just like related to the business, which is the only way that I was able to get my hours in was by waking up like super ass early, just like 4:30 a.m. and trying to put in some time helping with like the morning stuff, my wife and so forth, and just trying to sneak into work. And there's outside of that morning block, which was crushing my sleep, I was not getting any flow time. So the quality of the work degraded enormously. And this is something that's really hard to accept, especially for overachievers like us, and probably many of your audience members here too. Is just like you kind of like work really hard towards your career, and then suddenly you're like at 40% capacity of what your brain can accomplish, but also just like what you can output. And it's like crazy frustrating, right? To just be like, what am I doing here? Fortunately, I have a team that's really awesome, and most of us are have young families too. Many of us at least do. So there's a lot of empathy here too. But I don't think I respected, at least for myself as a dad, or gave myself enough forgiveness to just be kind of shitty at my job for a little period of time, right? We have investors, you and me, right? Like we have expectations of founders and so forth, and you don't want to let those folks down too.
Yeah.
But a lot of this is in your own head as well, because most people are pretty empathetic once they know that you're going through this stuff. So that's the thing I learned kind of in hindsight. Yeah.
Okay, cool. I'm curious if you did take a paternity leave of any kind, especially since you're the founder.
For the first kid, I was working at Facebook, and then so they gave us a generous 4 months off, and it was fantastic. So that was easy peasy relatively. For the second one, I was running the business with my two co-founders, and I didn't take really much off, maybe like a week or two. I think my thinking around this too was less. I don't have too much regret around this because I was so present. Like I work in the garage. I've been here for the last 7 years. So, I was always in proximity to the house, and I can come in really, really quickly. And, my schedule of meetings were relatively light. I was trying to do more IC work during that period of time, just mostly emails and things like that. So while I would have appreciated some rest, it was fine. But not many people are afforded that kind of flexibility. And that deeply makes me sad about America.
Right. Yeah, I think the average paternity leave is like 1 week. So it's what surprised you most about the postpartum period, especially when it comes to like breastfeeding or anything like that, in terms of like how you were able to contribute to sort of the routine there?
Yeah. Again, doing all the cleaning, the cooking, the diaper changing, I think it was like sort of like table stakes. I think like what I didn't anticipate was I don't know if my wife, I don't think had very much postpartum depression. Fortunately, she did have her down moments, but it wasn't too acute from what I understand or could tell at least. And but it was actually kind of depressing, just even for the dad as well. So in my case, again, it was like the identity stuff, which is just like I'm so shitty at my job. I used to be good at it. I'm kind of shitty at being a parent too because I'm like so tired. I felt that way, especially with the second kid. I was like, man, I've got no resilience right now, right? Like, why am I so snappy to my 3-year-old son right now?
Yeah.
And that felt bad. So like, just feeling like you're kind of bad at everything, was hard. And the coaching that I always give to new parents today, especially on the dad side, is just like recognize that this is going to happen. And also recognize that the vast majority of people are quite forgiving and understanding about your situation. And also finally recognize that it gets better. Like you can get back to 100%. It'll just take a little bit of time.
How long did it take you to feel like you were back at 100%?
2 years.
Okay. That's good.
Yeah.
Okay.
It wasn't that great, but like, to be honest with you, yeah, I think it took about 2 years.
Okay, interesting. What surprised you most about having a baby? And also, one other thing specific to dads is I feel like a lot of dads sometimes have trouble feeling that connection right after birth. And a lot of times it doesn't even happen until the baby's first smile, which isn't even really a smile. It's more just like passing gas, but that's a few weeks after birth. So did you experience that too? And what was the surprise in general?
I think the big surprise is how long it was for me to truly love my kids. So like with my son, maybe about 6 months where I started to feel that bond,
What do you think was it that made you feel the bond?
Probably parental leave. I mean, like once I scheduled it like month 3 in, like then I started, and then that was a very rapid period of development, like month 3 to 6 and so forth. So like I could see the smiles and all that. And it was a lot of quantity time for my daughter. Sorry, Stella. Probably 18 months.
Interesting.
It took a long time for me to really, really, really love it. Now, holy shit, I love you, girl, if you're watching this. But like, it was hard, right? Like, we kind of were just like at that point where things were getting chill with my son. He's 3, diaper change, like no more diapers, all that stuff. Really cute still. And then we introduced this little blob, and then it gets hard again. And she wasn't a very difficult personality. She's like a slightly worse sleeper, but not even that acute. And I would just say that it took me an odd amount of time to really feel it. And it wasn't until she really began to speak and I got a great sense of her personality where like it completely flipped the other way. I was just like, wow, you are an amazing human. And I will say, Stella, if you're watching this, and I do hope you see this at some point, that you have completed the family. Like in
Oh,
hindsight, I can say that like when we had you, that's when it started to really feel complete, especially after you started talking. And I think you are actually the person that's going to hold our family together long term.
that
That's
is
my
so sweet. I'm tearing up a little bit. That is so sweet. Was there an exact moment where you felt that connection, either with your son or daughter?
Let's talk about my daughter some more. So, like, the thing that I really appreciate about her is she's an identical clone to my wife.
Hmm.
Like, they look the same. So, first of all, like, I'm not sure where my DNA is. She's got my square head, but that's about it. The second thing though is just she has exact same personality. My wife is a really strong woman and she can advocate for herself really fiercely, which is something I've always admired about her. My daughter is the same way too.
Mhm.
And it's not just advocating for herself. She advocates and protects all of her friends and then even stands up for her brother too.
Mhm.
So her older brother. So once I started to see that she had that kind of innate confidence within her, and not only that is just like really funny too, just like my wife. I started to understand like like why she was such a needed part of our family, right?
Mhm.
Like I'll give you like a very macabre thing here, which is like my wife and I joke about like if I'm like at the end of my life, I'm like on like a life support system. Like my son will probably be in the corner, like crying to himself like this, like, "Oh, what are we gonna do?" And then my daughter Stella will be like, "Look, Owen, we gotta kill dad. Like this is what he wants, right?" Like she'll like pull the plug for me and just like, I got you, dad. I know what's happening here, right?
Yeah.
So it's just like once I saw that kind of level of leadership and just like the fact that, good Lord, like we somehow have cloned my wife. Um, it was amazing to just like sort of feel that now I have like two amazing women in my life.
Yeah, that's so sweet. How early did you start to see those traits, and like in what kind of capacity could you see them if she's like so young?
Around a year, I'd say, is like when you start to notice this stuff, especially around self advocacy. Like she has her own way of communicating, like, I need more oranges, right? Or just like, or even like this happened a little bit a few years later, but like, this is a moment I'll never forget. I think I was being a little bit mean to her. And then she started crying, and she's like 2.5 this year at this point. And then she comes to me, she says, like, why are you being so mean to me right now? Right. And like I was like shook by that comment. I was just like, wow, like, she wants to have this conversation. And then we had to have a very honest discussion of
Mhm.
just like, man, like, I think I've overreacted here too, but these are the behaviors that I noticed. Again, she's got no prefrontal cortex, so Lord knows what she actually got from that. But I loved that she advocated for herself, right?
Yeah.
And when I saw that, that was a huge inflection too, just like, this is gonna be a really strong woman someday.
That's
Yeah.
so sweet. Yeah, my last questions are just around parenting. And I think it's interesting because you're the parent that I've interviewed with the oldest kids.
Yeah.
Like I know Elizabeth's are kind of around the same age in
Actually, hers
general.
are a year older each. So yeah, she's got
Yeah,
that mantle. Yeah.
yeah. Cool. So yeah, so I guess like what are your thoughts kind of in general on parenting? And what kind of literature did you consume around parenting? Like it sounds like you do regularly consume literature around it. Do you have certain like ideologies or ethoses that you lean when it comes to parenting? Like one that's really common with millennials in particular is this concept of gentle parenting. So I'm curious if you prescribe to any ideology or just how you think about forming your own habits.
Yeah. My parents are Korean immigrants, first generation. So they're pretty tough, like,
Yeah.
tiger parenty, all that jazz. And I appreciate it in some ways because it did compel me to work really hard and do stuff. But I guess it kind of skips a generation here a little bit because like I find myself to be way lax. Same with my wife on
Mhm.
a lot of things. Like just we're a very go with the flow kind of family. I don't really push them too hard. This might be controversial on things like school yet.
Mhm.
I just don't. I kind of think that social emotional learning is more important when you're young than like, did you get an A in history? Third
Yeah.
grader. So like, I think that's one thing. But what I do like to do is I try to talk to my kids sort of like adults. You know, I don't use the same language, but I will share very direct feedback with them. Just like, you know, I'm talking to like a teammate or to my wife.
Mhm.
I think another thing too is just like emphasizing how much my wife like communicate to each other in front of them. So if we have an
Mhm.
argument, we'll do it in front of them and conclude it in front of them. If we
Mhm.
like want to hug and kiss each other, we'll do that in front of them. Like I just want them to get like the well-rounded kind of experience and hopefully a good mental model of what their relationships could look like in the future for whomever
Yeah.
they want to settle with if they do. And I think like the last thing here too is, you know, there's this sort of phase that's is kind of annoying for a lot of parents, which is like the kids keep asking you questions, ask why. I made a
Mhm.
commitment, so did my wife, where I will always try to keep answering their questions. So
Mhm.
whenever they have something to ask me, I want them to understand that I'm taking their question very seriously. And it gets fucking annoying. But like it's but like it also is good for me, right? Because like
Yeah.
I need to start to understand like, so like, you know, the Big Bang Theory, you know, like you know, what were the conditions for why this thing exploded? Well, like we're gonna have to do some research here because I don't really know.
Mhm.
So, but it's cool to go down that rat hole. But I don't want them to stop asking questions. I
Yeah.
think that's really important. And I think my parents, I love you, mom and dad, shut me down pretty quick on that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, it's interesting because yeah, I feel like it's so touching to hear you say that because my parents were divorced. They got divorced when I was 3. So I actually didn't feel like I had regular exposure to a relationship until like, unless it was through media, which I feel like wasn't that accurate. Until like college when my
Hmm.
friends started dating people.
Yeah.
So I feel like that like early exposure is super important. I'm curious if you've heard of gentle parenting, and if there are any like go-to resources, if you have or haven't heard of it.
I'm actually not familiar with it at all. Is there like
Mhm.
a TLDR you can share with me to
Yeah,
teach me how
yeah.
to do it?
It's basically like, yeah, it's become really popular amongst, yeah, like millennials. And there's like a lot of gentle parenting influencers, but basically the whole concept is like treat your kids like humans, and just like adults, like let them have their own preferences. Don't create like strict boundaries without kind of informing them of like what their choices are meaning,
Yeah.
and like
Yeah.
their buy-in on things. So there's this whole like gentle format versus like the antonym of it would be like aggressive parenting, which is, yeah, like the more like stereotypically Asian style that
Yeah.
my mom tends to have as well.
Yeah, I'm gonna guess that we kind of lean more towards gentle as well.
Yeah.
We're all the millennial stereotypes. Like I eat avocados and toast. You know, uh yeah, we do all the millennial things, experiences over things, kind of minimalist in our household, all that
Yeah.
stuff. But like yeah, I think like this may be the wrong way of thinking about it, but at the end of the day, I'm gonna assume that we can raise our kids to being adults, and then the relationship is going to be more like peers and friends at some point. And I like introducing that a little bit to them early because I think a part of it is also driven by the fact that I want them to get really comfortable around working with and speaking to adults too, to some degree,
Mhm.
right? We're in California, and I send my kids to fairly far left leaning charter school right now. So like some things are already kind of weird. Like growing up in Detroit, like I'd say like Mr. Bahn or Mrs. Bahn or something like that. They all
Yeah.
call me Eric, right? Even like the kindergartners, right? Like Eric, can you like help me? I'm like, still weird, but okay, you know. But I kind of dig
That's
it because
funny.
like it kind of they bring me in. I notice just psychologically a little bit more as a peer, and I dig that. So I'm trying to find that balance, but we are quite gentle and not tigerish at all.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Did you have any go-to like forms of literature or like book recommendations on parenting?
No, I kind of stopped reading all that stuff because I realized that I don't know. There's sort of a baseline instinct that now I just follow and trust. And then the
Yeah.
thing that really drives us is actually our values.
Mm.
So, like the great thing about having established values that are written down is that you can always point to that picture on the dining room table with like our values and say like, if we do this, is it consistent with the values that we set for this year?
Mm,
Right. And that is a really clear rubric generally in terms of just
yeah.
like how we should spend our time together. So it's that part has been really great for us. And I think just I will share this one like piece of parenting advice. Measurement is also critical. If it gets
Mm,
measured, it gets done. It's just like startups, right? If you're
yeah.
trying to like measure things like, retention or something like that, then you measure it in a dashboard and hopefully you can solve it, or it at least reminds you to solve it. We have like chore charts, with like things with, that where you can mark off what you've done. We have like our own version of OKRs that are kind of related to our values as well. And so, it gets done. It starts to just form those habits. Like my son knows that he just has to do 20 minutes of piano. It's just as much as he needs to like take a shower and breathe at this point, or make his
Yeah.
bed, like it's small kind of habits that you just turn into just like, just live this way. And then, it's just going to set you up hopefully for a successful path by just like
Mm,
learn how to develop good habits and measure it.
yeah. Okay, cool. I'm curious if you asked your son to do piano or if he had an interest in inherently.
So I'm trying not to, my wife and I are trying not to force too many activities. We think that two
Yeah.
is the right per kid. So like something kind of sporty or moving your body, and maybe something a little bit more artistic like music or art.
Mhm.
In the beginning, I think you just got to introduce it to them and then probably stick with it for like a year or so at least, just to see whether they're into it. But I don't want to do what my parents did. They like shoved a violin in my face and then the piano in front of me. And I
That's what
hated
my
it.
mom did.
And I actually think I enjoyed the instruments, but I hated the fact that my parents forced it on me. So that's
Me
why I
too.
stopped.
I feel the same way.
Yeah. And then my son likes piano. So like I see him playing every once in a while just in his own. So I think he's gonna stick with it. With things like sports, like he developed his own interest in soccer that is quite acute now. And so I followed him. I was just like, if you want to do it, let's do it. Right.
Yeah.
Similar to my daughter, I think she's going to be a little bit more of like drawing, visual arts kind of person. So trying to, explore that. But we're going to put stuff in front of her that she didn't ask for, just to see if it
Yeah.
sticks. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. How do you define your routine today with your kids, especially because you and your wife both work?
Well, we're still like spoiled as hell because we have kept our nanny. And
Okay.
I didn't mention this, but this
Oh
is
yeah,
like a
yeah. I was
critical
gonna
thing.
ask what kind of nannies you had early on, especially if you had a night nanny.
No night nanny, although I think it's a great investment, especially for kid number one, just
Mm,
because you have no idea what you're doing and you're tired. So
right.
it's not a bad idea. Or even like one of those awesome Chinese postnatal folks that like make you the soup and all that stuff like that. I
Yeah.
think those are kind of neat too. We didn't have any of that though, but we did have my parents. And then about 6 months in is when we decided to go for a nanny. And like they are really expensive, but I will say that probably the best investment we've ever made because she does serve as connective tissue for us on everything in our life. Right now she is largely in charge of dropping off and picking up the kids or moving them around to, their activities after school because school ends sometimes at 12 o'clock for a
Yeah.
kindergartner. Or and making sure that they're fed and showered and things like that. Just like the critical activities between like 8 and 5.
Mhm.
So during the weekday. So if you can afford it or could find like a good like daycare, I think it's such an important investment. And I keep saying this word investment. It's so easy to fall into this notion of cost. No,
Mhm.
like getting that time back where you can get into flow state, getting back into your career will make you more money on net than I
Yeah.
think without. But I realize that is a ridiculously privileged statement because the reality is people can't pay $30 an hour in the Bay Area for a nanny very often. And it makes me so sad because I do think that this creates crazy marital thrash. Like me and my wife, we're in great shape, but I think a huge contributing factor to that is the fact that we have a lot of help.
Mm, okay. Interesting. Have you stuck with the same nanny since that 6 month point?
We've had one nanny and then she stopped. She just I think decided to retire just generally. And then we had another nanny right after. So we've been lucky too in that we didn't have to shop ever for like
Yeah.
different kinds of folks, and both have been unbelievably wonderful.
Okay, that's awesome. My last question is, what is your favorite thing about parenting and what does it mean to you to be a good parent?
So I think my favorite thing about being a parent is goes back to a statement I made earlier. Like you can take away like all the spiritual stuff of like, oh, it's wonderful to have a child. At the end of the day, I used to have one best friend that lived with me, and now I have two more. Right? Like it really just comes down to that like selfishness every day that I feel of like these are like the dopest people I've ever met in my life. Right? Like, and we just like really like each other and spending time with each other. And you know, I get to do all the stuff that like I forgot I loved, like, you know, trying to catch lizards outside, or like trying to grow a prickly pear cactus that we've found, you know. You know, these are just like small things that allow you permission to be silly, right? And that's kind of like, you know, you mentioned something earlier, which is like about the minivan brand I have. It's quite
Yeah.
intense because, you know, I just rat holing on this just a minute here. The
Yeah.
reason like I like this stuff is there is a strange culture of emasculation when it comes to things like minivans. Like, oh, you've given up, like especially as a dad, or like, wow, like I can't believe you're not like embarrassed to drive that thing versus like a truck or SUV. First of all, how emasculating is it that I have actually created children with my wife? Like literally, like that is a masculine activity, at least for me, right? Like the fact that like I have kids, right? So isn't that a
Yeah.
flex? Part one. Part two is
Yeah.
this though, which is just like we should be like lean into it and celebrate the fact that you know, you are a dad, and it's something that you're really proud of, and you're just like, you know, it's a minivan is like almost a symbol of like the fact that you get to have a family, right?
Mhm.
And I'm going to set aside the bigger comments, which is just like they're the best vehicles in the planet. Like the utility of it, the size of it, the doors going like this with school drop offs, like all you can haul. We won't talk about that right now. So, but I like cycling this because I just think that it's so silly, these tropes about what is masculine or not and so forth. So I want to take like the other side of that and make minivans cool again for everyone, moms and dads. Um, so, okay, now I've blacked out the whole extent of the question,
Oh
but
yeah, no
that's
worries.
part of it.
It was, what was your favorite thing about being a parent, and what does it mean to be a good parent?
I don't know what it means to be a good parent yet. You know, that's
Mhm.
something that I'm trying to try with like quantity time and quality time and hopefully being present and so forth. I think that's going to
Yeah.
be a question for my kids a little bit later as to
Mhm.
like, am I someone that's really attentive to your needs? Do you feel supported? Do we think that we have a close relationship? The number one thing I do want right now in this stage, especially before and through their adolescence, is feeling completely safe with mom and dad, that we can actually
Mhm.
have honest conversations about really tough things, right? Like
Mhm.
as a teenager, I hold up, like I just stopped talking, right? I just didn't want to talk to my parents at all. I would just hang out in the basement by myself. I don't want that for my kids. I want that kind of relationship where if we have to have awkward conversations about sex or just relationships or like being bullied, you know, like we can have that kind of space of real trust. And the only way that I can sort of demonstrate that is by having those analogous conversations with my wife in the adult world, of just like
Right.
people have to deal with that I don't like, you know, how am I going to deal with it? Or just showing that like we can establish a safety at least to each other. So
Mhm.
if we can get that, I think it'll be good. If we can't, it'll be a problem, but I'll try to keep working on it.
Okay, love that. Cool. Well, that's all the questions that I have, but I really appreciate you being on, and just participating and also being vulnerable.
Of course. Catherine, I absolutely admire what you and your team at Anja are doing with this mission of building more accessibility and knowledge and education around the opportunity for cord blood banking. I think it's so cool. And the fact that you also could create this kind of space too, to have very honest conversations about parenting and childbirth and all these topics. I so appreciate you for this. And it was a real honor to chat with you like this today.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, awesome.